This video walks through the studio leathercraft building process I used to make a couple of different sized raised and lined molded saddle leather cases very accurately by molding, stretching, and cutting the leather around harder materials. This process is the same design and studio construction process as most artisans would use to make things with wood, but with the specialized saddlery tools used to work with natural veg tan leather. I believe the same skills of drawing, cutting, gluing, and finishing to a high degree of accuracy are transferable, as well as the skills that require a great deal of precision, which can be improved with the help of precisely made construction jigs. Saddle leather can be molded and shaped as far as the leather can be stretched. So we need to take that into consideration when we are making the molds, because leather can be stretched too far and become weak or tear. With that in mind, this luxurious business card case and petty cash box are molded 5/8 of an inch deep, with simple raised areas with gentle corners that are reinforced and lined to strengthen the stretched parts into very strong and durable pockets. A leather petty cash box can be used like a tip jar or a piggy bank, loaded with a few coins, billfolds, or payment cards to pay for miscellaneous delivery charges, etc., that would come up in any professional work environment. The two cases are built in similar ways, but with a few variations in the details. To make negative and positive wet molded pockets, I drew the mold patterns in 1:1 scale. The molds are cut from 1/4 inch laser grade MDF, but the raised areas are in 1/8 inch. If you do laser cutting, it is important to buy the sheets of MDF that'll fit into your machine and are meant to be cut with the machine you use to avoid fire. Since I use 3 to 4 ounce vegetable tan leather, or leather that is a 1/16 of an inch, the space between the negative and the positive is a 1/16 of an inch. When I mold a pocket with a lining, I generally assume the shrink rate will be the same for the top and bottom mold, or the negative and positive will shrink at the same rate. So the negative mold on the bottom is offset a 1/16 of an inch to fit into the mold top tightly. I use the same methods when making and using acrylic templates and glue up jigs for lined parts. Normally when we think of a side of natural saddle leather, we think of a hide that has been stretched flat, so the depths are created with a wet molding process that squeezes a wet flat piece of leather into a shape that after drying retains that shape, so over time the molds we use become a very important part of the process and an economical way of making pockets, because the molds can be used over and over again. Since palm-sized cases are not very big, creating the layers and the molds does not require a lot of material or square footage of MDF to make them. As the cut pieces come out of the laser printer, the 1/16 of an inch spacer is removed and sorted. The laser burns through the MDF, which leaves the edges charred, so the inside edges need to be sanded before glue up. To make sure the little pieces are all lined up when gluing, I laser cut 1/8 of an inch alignment holes and use the same size dowels as reference pins. I like to use an assortment of spring clamps and wait until the glue has had a chance to set before cutting the reference dowels flush with a small saw. Then all the surfaces are sanded in progression from 120 grit to 220 grit sandpaper. The details in the finished leather pieces will depend on the quality of the mold used, so taking the time to gently round the corners will help avoid sharp edges tearing into the leather. And even though I use plastic wrap to protect the mold and allow the part to release better, a nicely fitting mold will allow the mold to release easier too. All the sanding dust needs to be removed or it might end up in the finished product. So a slightly damp paper towel will help remove any dust remaining. When testing the mold for the first time, I like to slowly squeeze the mold together to make sure everything fits before spraying the MDF molds with a durable acrylic top coat finish. The leather used here was bought from Wickett & Craig. It's their standard grade vegetable tan strap leather and molds easily. I soaked the leather for 10 minutes in room temperature water and squeezed the leather into the mold using plastic wrap as a moisture barrier and to help release the leather after it is squeezed into the mold. I use a small workbench vise and clamp, squeezing until the mold is tight for about 20 minutes, then release the parts. Smaller size molds that are built very precisely do not require much pressure to squeeze the mold tightly. Small C-clamps work well to hook onto a small hard surface. If there are any problems with the molding like causing tears, the MDF can be sanded to fit at this point before final finishing. The time I spend making the molds is an investment I want to last, so finishing with a durable top coat to extend the life of the molds is time well spent. After the molds are finished and the test pieces are bone dry, the acrylic work can begin with accurate measurements. Leather shrinks, swells, and changes shape when the leather is being worked on and products like dye, glue, and conditioning oils are applied to it. So the acrylic cutout and glue-up jigs are used to help counteract this effect, keeping the pieces lined up, or in construction terms, keeping the materials and parts made from them square. Obviously, molded parts are stretched and have the potential to recoil and change shape after molding, drying, and further processing, so rough cutting the pocket before other products are applied, with a following trim cut to fit the pocket square during final assembly is a necessary step to think about before starting the project. Like the MDF wet molds that have several layers glued together to produce deep shapes, an 1/8 of an inch acrylic jig can be used to bend leather around a 1/16 of an inch leather liner to fill shallow shapes. Like everyone on a budget, I am concerned with the cost and storage of the materials I use, so all the 1/8 of an inch acrylic I cut for the pattern templates can be repurposed for glue-up jigs. Having a subscription to AutoCAD allows me to alter my drawings anytime I want and laser print changes to jig parts in a few minutes, which makes controlling the raised and lined elements I want to add or take away easier. All the acrylic parts I add to the original design are implements that guide my tools and materials very precisely. So when I want to use different specialized tools or different thicknesses or types of leather, these parts might require adjustments or entirely new jigs to accommodate the changes effectively, if I want to use the original design molds. Most people will agree that it is easier to cut leather on a flat surface, but sometimes that is not always an option, especially when cutting lined molded parts. So to avoid a freehand cutting mistake, bending a piece of acrylic to cut accurately around a corner is an option. To make a bent acrylic cutout jig, I cut the acrylic corner piece long enough to fit around the corner and positioned the acrylic with the top being the bend in a small vise. Then with a commercial heat gun, I applied heat to that bend and fixed the 90-degree angle around the shape of the mold. An airbrush is an excellent way to apply dye to leather. A Phoebe's product called EcoFlow Coal Black and Canyon Tan were used here. A mask and rubber gloves are needed shop supplies, and ventilation, of course, to protect your health. Then the leather should be left to dry. I like to wait a few hours before skiving the edges. Wet leather tears easily and is difficult to maintain a consistent thickness or uniform edge. This horizontal raised and lined window pocket jig is shaped for a 1/4 inch seam on the outside and inside window seam that is cut out after gluing. This strong and sturdy jig, made from cast acrylic, is accurate to within a 1/16 of an inch, but only with the help of human hands guiding the leather to fit into it, of course. Gluing in the lining first, then stretching the leather around it to match up the edge is easier with lots of little clips to gently squeeze the edges together uniformly before the glue dries. When clamping larger surface areas, larger spring clamps are needed. I like to stitch the open pocket seam first to make the open edge permanent. Then the leather can be stretched tightly against the finished edge to make an accurate seam around the window opening. The leather working skills I like to focus on involve a perfect seamed and finished edge because the same steps involved are in every project I start. Like most artisan crafts or trades, there are a series of repetitive steps during construction. Acrylic jigs act as a fence protecting the surface that is not supposed to be cut into. Sharp tools and appropriate cutting and punching surfaces make the project easier to add intricate details with less risk of damaging finished surfaces. Planning out in advance, I know I will need to rough cut pieces of leather, do some molding, shaping, and cut the leather to fit. Then layer by layer made into parts and later stitched together as a finished product. These are very repetitive cycles, so all the jigs I make allow me to work faster while I am maintaining accuracy. This vertical raised and lined window pocket jig is shaped for a raised and lined strip below a 1/4 inch seam on top, and a similar raised and lined strip on the bottom, with a finger window in between them that is cut out and seamed after gluing. These two raised and lined strips add extra strength and act as a foot for the petty cash box to rest on. The areas of the case designs I like to focus on are the latch or the parts that most frequently are moved with human hands. Adding extra layers or wear leather and reinforcing the areas supporting hardware will be to an advantage for the user and worth creating the jigs that allow the details to be implemented easily into the finished product. Then working with the glue-up jigs, I like to smooth the contours around the raised lining with a small spoon-shaped leather carving tool before the glue has a chance to set. This makes the contour detail stand out. I like to use hand-pressed dies to attach the line 24 snap fastener, and to make the fastener stronger, I reinforce the back with a raised leather washer, then hide the back of the snap when gluing in the lining. As part of the design process, when I made the wet molds, I also made a unique workbench a 1/16 of an inch smaller than the inside lining mold, to fit tightly underneath the bone-dry molded parts. This little workbench allows me to cut out the opening and to make the punching and stamping of the molded and raised parts accurately and easier every time I use the molds. This pull tab design uses dowels as glue-up jigs to gently bend a round shape. Since I skived down the edges and stitch marked the top part of the seam, a larger dowel is used to smooth that edge together tight, then going down to a smaller dowel to create a tighter looped seam before the glue dries. This technique helps me create a more uniform shape. Then gluing the pull tab in stages makes it easier to stitch the sides before attaching the ends. I find the saddle stitch the best choice to use for hand stitching leather. I use John James number 004 Saddler's harness needles because they are small yet very durable, and chose Ritza 0.6mm bonded nylon thread because it is very strong with tight fibers that resist a thread catching. For the thicker pockets I use 0.8mm thread with the same needles. All the little details are important, and some of the raised and lined elements involve several layers, which all need to line up. So with the help of the acrylic pattern and a piece of acrylic for support, it is easy to glue the end raised and lined element into the top of the pull tab. Without a strategy of proper tools, work surfaces, and jigs to control how the leather moves as it is being worked on, would make sewing a straight uniform seam considerably more difficult or almost impossible to achieve a consistent result. To smooth out any air bubbles trapped between the layers when gluing, a heavy glass square burnishing tool with a uniform flat edge and a hard flat work surface like a slab of marble is what I use when gluing flat parts. Glue is meant to hold the leather in place until the parts can be more permanently sewn together with a strong and durable thread. I like to be able to assemble the parts in stages, gluing and stitching the contours of the leather as I progress. So as I apply glue, it is important to control where it goes and to add pressure to the materials being glued to create the strongest bond. I like to assemble the parts in stages, gluing and stitching the contours of the leather as I progress. So as I apply glue, it is important to control where it goes and to add pressure to the materials being glued to create the strongest bond. The keeper for the pull tab is easy to shape very precisely around the mold. However, leather stretches differently as it is being stretched into shape. So I like to smooth the seams with a few different tools to gently coax the leather into its more permanent shape before stitching. Glue is meant to hold the leather in place until the parts can be more permanently sewn together with a strong and durable thread. A stitching awl can be used to place stitches anywhere the needles will pass through from both sides. When stitching on the side of a molded shape, I use my stitching chisels to mark the hole spacing, then punch through with a stitching awl using a punch pad on the back for support, being careful not to punch through my fingers. Neatsfoot oil is an oil rendered and purified from the shin bones and feet of cattle, and it works well to soften and condition natural vegetable tan saddle leather. It needs to be applied with care. I like to rub a little at a time to the surface with a small sponge applicator. Apply the oil in an even layer, and if the oil is absorbed quickly and not penetrating through to the back, I add a little bit more. But I do not let the oil pool on the surface and wipe off excess. It is easier to add and impossible to take away and can leave a blotchy finish. So I like to finish with a wax type of a conditioner for a smoother and harder finish. All the work done during the design process, making jigs and whatnot, pays off in speed and accuracy during the construction phase. The final conditioning is when the stiff building material is turned into a luxurious, soft to the touch leather case. I like to use a Phoebe's oil and wax product called Aussie and use paper towels to rub it in, then remove the excess. A bone folder is an excellent tool to help open the back pocket a little bit, making it easier to condition inside the pocket. I will condition again in a few days after the conditioner has had a chance to be absorbed, then add more conditioner when needed. The conditioner will help stop the strap leather from cracking and provide a nice soft finish that allows the saddle leather to age gracefully as it is being used, developing into a worn-in patina that improves with age.